Hello, my name is Tiffany Rockhold, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Today, we're interviewing one of my favorite people, author Brian Nixon. Brian, thank you for being here.
Great to be with you, Tiffany, and it's fun to be in this environment because normally we do
It
things
is.
together, but you're actually interviewing me now.
I know. I love it. I'm really excited to get to do this. Like I said, Brian's one of my favorite people. I get to interact with Brian on a daily basis,
Yep.
usually at work, and Brian is so gifted and talented, and one of my favorite things about Brian is how he sees the world through the Lord's eyes and how he really wants to look at things and see things as beautiful as God created them to be. So we are going to dive in to his newest book called Tilt. So Brian, first, tell us about Tilt. What's it about?
Well, Tilt is
we dive
really
in.
a cultural exploration, finding the intersection between Christianity and contemporary culture. And so I bring the audience, the readers, on a ride, a voyage of discovery, if you will. And in the book, I kind of liken it to finding God's fingerprints within culture. And even though we're kind of in the post-Christian world, I still think there's enough Christian influence in our culture where when you see it, you kind of go, aha, I recognize that, I notice that.
Yeah.
So I, as a journalist, I cover a lot of different stories, a lot of different people. And so what you have in this book are kind of some of my observations.
And I love how you organize the book. Being a very administrative person, I appreciated that. Can you tell the audience how you structured the book?
Yeah. Tilt is structured very simply. I follow the definition of a noun. It's structured under people, places, things, and ideas. And so the idea of it was some of the times I'm covering people, other times I'm in specific places, and then there's ideas. A lot of the ideas are pretty heady, in there, but it really is just a fun way to kind of organize a book around what a noun is.
I think it's very unique in the way that it's structured and in the way that you've written. I think it's very unique as far as other things that I've read, and I really enjoyed it. So tell me, how did Tilt even come about? What was that? How did you go, oh, I can put all of this together?
Yeah.
What was that process?
Well, I've been writing journalism, or I've been writing articles as a journalist for over 15 years. A friend of mine named Dan Wooding, who used to run a CIS news service, he's a really notable, award-winning Christian journalist. About 15 or so years ago, he couldn't make it to an event at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. There was a new tent revival going on, and Dan had called me and said, "Hey, Brian, I can't make it. Would you mind going to this event and writing up a short article for me?"
Okay.
And I said, "Dan, I don't do journalism. I mean, I do more academic stuff. I oversee, at the time, Chuck Smith's books and so on and so forth." But I said, "Sure, Dan, I'll go do it." And so I went and wrote the article for him, and he goes, "Hey, that was great. Do you mind now going with me to another story? And I'm going to interview Jane Russell, the famous actress who was Marilyn Monroe's, kind of competition
Yes.
of the day.
Yes.
I'm going to interview Jane Russell." And this was in Beverly Hills. "Brian, why don't you go find someone else to interview that was there?" So I'm like, "Oh, okay, I've never been to a Beverly Hills shindig." So we go into the Beverly Hills Hotel. He finds Jane Russell. He's interviewing her over there. And I'm kind of like, okay, what do I do? Who do I interview? So Jane Russell happened to be with a companion. I don't know if he was a manager or whatever, but he was sitting there.
Yeah.
And I noticed he was wearing ostrich cowboy boots. So I said, okay, I'm going to do an article about Jane Russell's companion's cowboy boots. And it turned out he grew up in New Mexico, so we had some things in common. And that really was kind of the springboard for me to start writing for Assist News regularly. So over the years, I've covered stories, everything from Cormac McCarthy to Robert Redford and everyone in between. And I've always tried to find a Christian correlation. Like, what can I learn as a Christian from what this person's saying? So that's how this book spawned. It really is a collection of articles from the past 15 years.
Now, this might be a strange question, but in all of your research, all of your travels, has there ever been a time where you've gone, gosh, that was really hard to find a Christian perspective on something?
Yeah, no, and there has been. And quite frankly, in those situations, sometimes I won't write an article. Like I'll just go, you know what? It was either disturbing or there was something like, I can't find anything that was worthy of writing about in this. Or what I do is I completely take a different angle and go, okay, this is what this person said, but this is what the Bible has to say about a certain situation or circumstance. So there have been those incidences that have been awkward, but I still find something in it. Let me give you an example of that. So, so Shia LaBeouf, the famous actor, was here in town. And once the word got out that he was here in town, he was here to protest, but he was doing it through a performance art piece. So once they found out that he was here in town, it was like, Brian, go down there and try to find Shia LaBeouf. And so I went downtown, and lo and behold, I found Shia LaBeouf, and I found the other artist, I believe his name was Luke Turner. It's in the book. And, you know, not that I'm not against protest if it's done, you know, peacefully and in accordance with the laws of the land. But, you know, there were some things said and some other sentiment that was being expressed that it's like, that's kind of weird. But what I did is I turned it around to go, okay, how is a Christian to protest? What is our responsibility in today's society? So, and by the way, Shia LaBeouf was he was a gentleman. I mean, he wasn't rude. He came up, he took pictures with our kids, and his artist friend, Luke Turner, was also a gentleman. These guys were very kind, very nice. But it was one of those situations like, I still found something to write about, even though it was really awkward. You know, like, okay, there's a protest going on here, but they were kind enough to give us some time.
Oh, I love that. And don't forget, he said it's in the book. So
you're
going to want to read that story and find out more about that one. Okay, I love that. All right, next. So how did Tilt actually begin, though? Like, was it another book that you needed, that was slated that you needed to write for an agreement? What was that process like?
So what was interesting is several years back, I was talking to a possible agent. And I shared with him, you know, this book idea. And he goes, this is a unique book. It's interesting. Particularly in the category, which I'm sure we're going to get to soon, the category that I write in, which is called theopoetics. And he goes, this is really interesting. A lot of people don't know what theopoetics is, and you're doing it from a journalistic standpoint, so this would be interesting. Well, you know, at the time I was thinking, okay, that's good, that's cool. But then after a while, I started to get the idea of constructing it under people, place, things, and ideas, and other things just started to fall into place. So I approached the publisher that really specializes in theopoetics, which is Whiff and Stock Cascade Publishers. They're out of Oregon. And I contacted the editor there. His name's Rodney Clapp. He's a legend in Christian publishing. He's you know, from Christianity Today to multiple publications. And I said, Rodney, here's a book I'm thinking of. It falls kind of in this theopoetics realm. What do you think? He said, love it, let's do it. So it wasn't one of those epiphany things. It was one of those, you know, it unfolded over a period of time. And then it was like, there's a book here. And then I just filled in different things, along the way.
Well, you mentioned something that people probably don't know the definition to. They might not have even ever heard the word until today, theopoetics.
Yeah.
Okay, tell us a little bit about what theopoetics is, what that means.
It's a big field, and it's one of those fancy words. But really, theopoetics in its basic form is theo, means God, and poetics is poetry. So in its basic understanding, it's the poetry of God. But in a more academic setting, it's the integration of the arts, imagination, creative thinking with theology. So it's where theology and these areas meet. In philosophy, we would call this area the transcendentals. And transcendentals are truth, beauty, and goodness. And historically, they would also have unity or simplicity mixed in there. But generally speaking, people know the transcendentals as truth. So that's kind of relegated to the sciences today. Beauty, well, that's arts and humanities. And then goodness, well, that's ethics and religion. But really, historically, those have always been integrated. And so theopoetics is really unpacking truth, beauty, and goodness in our world and writing about it. But here's something else to know about theopoetics. There's really two major schools of thought. First school and second school. First school began in the 1960s. There's a group of people that tried to come together and discuss these things. The second school may be a little newer in its inauguration, but it actually predates the first school in its authors. So a guy by the name of Hans Urs von Balthasar wrote a 15-volume book,
Oh my gosh.
15-volume sets on the theology of truth, beauty, and goodness. And what was interesting about Balthasar is he started with beauty first, because he, like C.S. Lewis, felt that one of the ways you could capture the imagination of our culture is by doing it beautifully. So C.S. Lewis wrote, his Chronicles of Narnia to capture, their people's attention and then give them the truth. And Balthasar was kind of the same mindset.
Thank you. I hope you got to learn a new word today and a new definition. So thinking of poetics, Brian's also written several poems that are featured throughout the book. Would you be willing to read one of those for our audience?
I sure will. And I'll start off by thanking the Penwood Review. I've been publishing poetry for years, and Penwood Review is a faith-based journal of poets. And so some of these poems were previously published with Penwood Review, but then Cascade picked them up for this book. So this one's called To Be is to Belong. And the background of this is one of the thinkers I've always respected is a fellow by the name of W. Norris Clark. He taught metaphysics or ontology at Fordham University. And this poem was inspired by his works and his life. So it's To Be is to Belong. As a child, I longed to climb trees, to get above things, to see far and overhead. I yearned to perceive how the geography fits together, the river and fields, the houses and streets. I sought to grasp the furthest point. And here I learned nothing finite will satisfy. So I continued to look beyond the horizon, asking questions and listening to the sparrows sing.
It's beautiful.
To be is to belong.
Tell us a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, the sentiment behind it is that, ontology, by the way, is the study of being. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there, a book before us rather than no book? And so ontology deals with that, among other things. And so W. Norris Clark was an expert or a professor of ontology and metaphysics. And in one of his books, he really talks about we as human beings are part of a community. And part of this is, though we have being, physical being, we ultimately know something deep down in our heart. We know that the finite is not all there is, that there's something beyond. And so we, as Christians, know that something beyond is God. There's something beyond just this physical world. And it's very akin to what Augustine says, and I paraphrase, there's a God-shaped hole in our life that only God could fill. And so W. Norris Clark was kind of saying something very similar. So in the poem, I capture some of his phraseology and then just put it in this idea of we're still looking, we're still finding God in unique places.
And I love that, because that's something that I think anytime I get to talk with you, you have this joy about you that no matter what you're walking through or what you've seen, you seem to find joy in everything. And I feel like we see this throughout the book. And I really appreciate that so much about you, Brian.
Well, thanks, Tiffany.
I love that you read that. So you talk a lot about art and artists. So why do you do that in the book?
Oh, boy. Well, Number one, art is really a thermometer for our culture. If you want to know what our culture is dealing with, or their feelings, go to the artists, be it the musicians, the poets, the writers, the visual artists. They are capturing the spirit of the age in what they're doing.
So true.
But secondly, I'm a painter. So I'm fascinated by the painting process. I personally think some of my best theopoetic work is done through painting, because it's not just me writing about painting, it's my painting is a theology. It is a theopoetics. And there's a particular methodology of how I approach painting. But third, I'm interested in the art because of the artists. I find artists to be fascinating.
I know.
Since a little kid growing up here in New Mexico, it was commonplace to hear George O'Keeffe, and then later, Frederick Hammersley, and then later, I was introduced to other artists such as Agnes Martin, and then later Max Cole, and all these artists that reside here in New Mexico. So it was kind of like osmosis. I was just introduced this, and I think as a kid that just stayed with me. So in high school, I kind of got infatuated with three artists, a fellow by the name of Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, and later Andy Warhol, and they were all at the beginning of the pop movement. Actually, Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, they bridged the gap between abstract expressionists and pop. But they were the guys that Andy Warhol was looking to. But these fellas really influenced me. So in high school, I was just enamored by these artists. So I started to hang out, not just with the arts kids, but we had a big group: musicians, artists, dancers. That was kind of the group I was hanging out with. And then in college, I was a music minor, and I also studied art history.
Well, I was going to say we've connected a lot on music, so you also play, right?
Right. Yeah, my background is I was in a post-punk band in high school. We were signed to a post-punk label, and we put out our one and only album in the late '80s.
What was that called?
The group was called The Electra. And two of the members went and found a label called Stone's Throw Records, which was it's an underground hip hop. And there was a documentary recently put out by a gentleman that won some awards. I don't necessarily prescribe to everything that's in that video, but it's fascinating. It kind of tells the story pretty much about Peanut Butter Wolf, whose name is Chris Manick. Wonderful human being. Chris Manick is a pure gentleman. He was in my wedding, and he started Stone's Throw, and highly respected in the underground. So in the video, there's Kanye West, there's people from Roots. I even think Snoop Dogg and other people are in this video, but I was in the group that kind of led up to these guys moving in a different direction with hip hop. But in the late '80s. I think really we were one of the first bands that integrated both hip hop and punk rock. As a matter of fact, I remember sitting down with the record, our A&R person at the record label. His name was Ducky, of all things, Stanford graduate, and he's just graduated from Stanford. He's meeting with us, and he's sitting there in his office, and he's going, "I don't know what you guys are doing, but I think it's going to be the next big thing." Because we were basically guys kind of from a neo-goth, post-punk thing. And then you had someone like Peanut Butter Wolf, Chris Manick, who was bringing in the hip-hop elements, and we were blending it up. And so something new was created. But then again, we split up, and they went and did their thing. And, of course, I went and did my thing.
Yes, but I love that you, as far as arts, I hope people are seeing there's a theme now. Brian is involved in pretty much every aspect of art that there is, and you're so good at it.
Well, I'm a curious. I have such an intellectual appetite. I'm so curious about so many things that I pursue them, and I just enjoy doing them all.
You totally do. Well, so what are some of the maybe odd things that set Tilt apart from maybe the average book?
Yeah. I think some of the odd things are probably under the things section.
Uh-huh.
You know, the people.
Yeah.
You know, those are like Cormac McCarthy and Sam Shepard and Robert Redford. George O'Keeffe is in there. Max Cole, another artist.
I'm telling you,
Yeah.
fantastic stories.
Yeah.
You need to read this one.
They're well known.
Yes.
You know, under the places, you know, Las Vegas, Chicago, Canterbury, England, you know, notable places. But it's the thing that's, you know, really interesting. That's where you get into like bicycles, typewriters, jazz, abstract art. Those are some of the areas that I think are like out of the ordinary. And again, that's just because of my interest. I'm interested in these things, so I pursue it. And I usually go find an event or a person to talk to, interview them, and then write about the Christian connection. So let's use typewriter as an example. Here in Albuquerque, there's I've always been interested in typewriters. I mean, back in the day when we were in the band, we used to type our lyrics on typewriters. This is before computers, you know. And plus, all the people we looked up to, they typed on typewriters. So there was Bob Dylan. You always saw pictures of him typing on a typewriter.
Yeah.
And then later, there was a fellow named Tom Waits. Tom Waits was typing up on his typewriter. And then more of our generation, a fellow by the name of Nick Cave. They were all typewriter guys. So we kind of tried to mimic it. You know, you're typing your lyrics up. So I've always had an interest in typewriters, more, I guess, as a cultural icon. But here in Albuquerque, there's a group called the Albuquerque Typewriter Association.
Wow.
And they put on these events. So I went and interviewed them and did some stuff.
My gosh.
And then I started to brainstorm and research of different Christians. What types of typewriters have they used? So I write about and give lists of Christian authors and the typewriters they use. So it's that type of rabbit hole. I jump down it, and then it just leads to other things. I kind of sometimes feel like I'm Alice, you know, that I'm falling down in a hole.
I love that. Okay, so why should someone read Tilt?
I think someone
What do you
should
think?
read Tilt, to become familiar with culture in general. I think it behooves Christians to understand our contemporary culture. We don't want to be those groups that just, you know, cloister ourselves and just sit and don't want to look. I think it's important for us to engage, to know what's being taught, and give appropriate responses.
Right?
But I think, secondly, why someone should read it is because it really does provide a template. Tilt is it's not just about tilting your head, which I explained in the introduction. At the end, I give a template as to how someone could tilt their head in the cultural exploration of all of this. So I think there's some practical aspects of this book as well. And then I think, thirdly, someone just may be interested in some of the topics or want to know a little bit more about maybe typewriters or bicycles or jazz or something else of that nature. Billy the Kid is in there. You know, someone may not know that Billy the Kid was in prison in Santa Fe for a short period when Lew Wallace, the territorial governor of New Mexico, was writing Ben-Hur. That's the kind of stuff that it's like one of the great Christian books of all time was being written while Billy the Kid was in prison in Santa Fe. So it's that type of little nuggets that you know, if you're just interested in little fact type stuff, you know, that's a good place to read as well.
Do you have a favorite portion of the book, whether it be an interaction with a person or an experience? Do you have a favorite?
Yeah, I think my favorite section is the places section.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, Rodney, the editor, he also said, I really like the places section. But I think, you know, every story in there has its place and it's kind of unique. But I think the one that was really cool for me was meeting Sam Shepard. So I went up to the Santa Fe Institute, which is a science think tank, and he was a Miller Scholar at the time there. I just happened to be giving a tour that day, and he was in the library. And the lady introduced me to Sam Shepard. Of course, he's a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He's an Academy Award nominated actor. And to meet him was cool because it's Sam Shepard, and I read his books. I checked out his books in the library as a kid growing up. So meeting him and then finding out he actually got his start in Christian theater. I mean, he was in what's called the Bishop's Theater Company, and he was touring, giving plays of C.S. Lewis. So it's an interesting thing. But yeah, that one stands out a lot for me.
I love that one. One of my favorites that you had in here was about Buddy Holly.
Yeah, yeah, and Buddy
I
Holly,
like that.
because you grew up a little bit in Southwest New Mexico, and so I went to Norm Petty Studios, and the gentleman was a believer who was running the studio at the time, but he let me in, and he gave me a full tour, and that caused me to investigate Buddy Holly and his beliefs and his life a little bit more, and so that made it in there as well.
It sure did. I remember being at the venue that he played at for the last time.
Yep.
For a show with clients several years ago. And
He's a legend.
yes, he is. Well, in closing, I did want to read just a little bit about with your epilogue. Brian did mention that he gives kind of it's a TILT acronym, and it helps equip readers. And so I think you should read it because he talks about how to do that. So basically it says the T is for take the time, the I is to investigate, the L is to listen, and the last T is to tell. So I hope that hearing Brian has compelled you to go and pick up this book. Now, Brian, where can people pick up the book?
Well, they can pick it up at Parchment's Bookstore in New Mexico. It's available on Amazon. It's available on Kindle. And, of course, the publisher, Cascade Books, has it available as well. And I just realized recently that it's also being carried in Europe. I saw on a Swedish book site that they carried as well.
Oh, great.
So if you want to order something in Sweden, order it from them. So it's available in a lot of different places.
There you go. Well, go and get this. Or if you know somebody who loves any art, any form of art or is involved in art, this is a really fantastic book to get. And I think we all can learn how to better find God in the midst of our everyday lives.
I agree, right? Tiffany. And thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being on, Brian.
What a pleasure.
I agree. Thank you. Take care.